So, everyone, good afternoon again. My name is Yemi. I use they, them pronouns. On behalf of the Learning VAW Network, we would like to welcome everyone to our virtual forum in which we will be looking within, talking about anti-Black racism and gender-based violence in the gender-based violence sector here on Turtle Island, specifically Canada. Our forum session today is anti-Black racism and the service provision in the gender-based violence sector. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I'm currently located in Toronto, which is the home of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and also home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also want to specifically provide, when I do land acknowledgements, a contextualization for Black folks. This especially involves taking into account how our presence as folks who do not arrive here, potentially in the same ways as European colonists, and that instead we were likely forced indirectly or directly by factors of white supremacy. And that this still, in this pattern of migration, perpetuates harm against Indigenous people, and that we are responsible for, and that we need to be accountable to. It is often, I also want to acknowledge, the often overlooked presence of Black Indigenous people who have dealt with both anti-Black racism and colonialism and anti-Indigenous sentiments in very different ways. And so deep appreciations to Jade Peak, as well as Black Like Me 613, who have shared this teaching. And we want to invite you to think about the traditional lands in which you are currently situated, knowing that folks are across Turtle Island that are present today, and that we cannot divorce the conversations of anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism and ongoing colonialism. And that Indigenous people who have cared for these lands, and in celebrating the continued strength of Indigenous folks and their continual resistance. The ongoing work towards truth and reconciliation must include bringing justice towards missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across Turtle Island, and that we must use that to inform our discussions today. Today's session is going to be 2 hours long, and I am excited, so excited. The session includes amazing panelists who I admire their work so incredibly deeply, and some of you may know their work. And I'll start off by introducing them, and they will go into a bit more detail, giving you a bit of their bio. So first we have Dr. Jacqueline Ben-John. We have Sophia Saran.
Would you like me to do a little introduction?
Oh, in just one moment, I was told to hold to allow them to spotlight you. I'm like, why am I so serious right now? Okay, and then next we have a dear friend, Debbie Usu Akia. Debbie, don't come for me because I just butchered the first part of your last name. And lastly, we have Abby. Amazing. Okay. So I'm going to invite the panelists to take a moment just to introduce themselves, and we can, actually, let's start off with Jackie. And so Jackie, if you want to go ahead and take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and the work that you do in relation to this panel.
Greetings, everyone, and thank you, Yami. My name is Jackie Ben-John, and I come to this topic based on my lived experience. I identify as an African Black cisgender woman in Canada, who is also a mother and a survivor and an immigrant. And I have witnessed my mother's experiences of gender-based violence and my own experiences as a survivor, and had the experience of survivorship along many forms of gender-based violence and institutional violence that I've survived, and so have many other African Black women and peoples. So coming to this topic of anti-Black racism in our sector is important to me, not only from lived experience, but also as someone who's worked in the sector for probably over 20 plus years now, having had opportunities to work in shelter and rape crisis centers. And I'm currently the executive director of the Women's Support Network of York Region, which is the only rape crisis center serving that entire catchment area. So I've kind of moved in and out of the sector, and I'm certainly back located within the sector as well. My doctoral research recently focused on the experiences of African Black women in the sector. Specifically, my work is entitled Redefining Feminist Resistance, Activism, and Empowerment in Rape Crisis Centers, African Black Women's Perspectives and Implications for Education. So that's a little bit about me, and I look forward to today's conversations. I thank the organizer for making it possible. I think it's an important conversation, and I'm pleased to be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, if we can move to Sophia, excuse me.
Hi everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel and for organizing. Thank you, Yami, for moderating and doing such an amazing and engaging job of it too. So my name is Sophia Sahan. I am a Montreal-based community organizer, and I want to add to Yami's land acknowledgement by acknowledging that I live, exist, and organize on Tiohtià:ke land, known as Montreal, which is the land of the Kanien'kehá:ka, which has always been a place of trading and of coming together for Indigenous peoples of this land. And adding again to Yemi's land acknowledgement, I always try to think of how my organizing and my existing on this land relates and engages with the people of this land and with the land itself as well. What do I get from this land? What do I take from this land? But also, what do I give back if I give back anything? So I am a community organizer, as I said, in Montreal. I currently work at the Disabled Women's Network of Canada, which is a national organization with members all throughout Canada. And we focus on disability justice for women and girls, and obviously including cis and trans women and non-binary people. But this is very, very old wording from a 25-year-old organization. But before I did that, I have always worked within the Black community in Montreal, specifically in a reactionary manner when things popped up. So housing crisis or arts and culture as well. We recently had in Quebec a theater piece that involved slave songs with absolutely no Black singers or actors, performers. I am also involved with Black Lives Matter Montreal, and again, in the reactionary, but also hopefully in the future in more planning and organizing. I've also long worked in gender-based violence, specifically sexual assault and sexual assault in university context, helping to create and correct the Bill 151 here in Quebec, which mandated all universities to come up with a resource center and an internal policy for how administration deals with sexual assault on campus. And yeah, I just work and try to focus my work on my people, and I have no shame in that. I don't put myself in situations anymore in which I will be silenced, or our issues will be put to the side or will be an add-on to a bigger issue, which is why I'm really thankful that this panel is here, so I can just blast everyone with some propaganda. And my personal studies, I focus on the erasure of Blackness and Black folk in archives in Canada. So going through Canadian and specifically Quebec archives to try to identify where Black archives have been destroyed or hidden, which is really interesting, but also very violent work. And yeah, that's all for me.
Thank you, Sophia. And I am here for the propaganda. I say it's speaking truth to power, so I'm here for it. Next, we will have Debbie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Debbie Owusu Acha. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based here in Ottawa on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I've been living, thriving, and existing in this town for about 10 years now. But I grew up in Brampton in the Toronto area, and that is actually the site of like the beginnings of my feminist activism as a young Ghanaian girl, resisting a lot of the expectations of me at home, and trying to figure out what that meant at a young age, and still learning and still being in that journey about what that even means in this context now at 28. I am very, very proud of my roots. I've mentioned that I'm Ghanaian. Being a West African not only informs my Blackness, but it informs how I understand my history, how I situate my own activism, and how I try to pay homage to my ancestors and the people who've taught me so much about resistance and activism, including my mom, even though she was the person I fought the most when I was growing up. But she is someone who I also attribute to being my first feminist teacher. I currently work as the new executive director at the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. That organization is a national organization that focuses on addressing discrimination through education-based workshops that focus on gender and sexual diversity across Canada. It's a youth-focused organization that has existed for a while now, but it's taking a new turn now that there's new leadership. And I'm excited to see what the future of the organization has to hold, with not only just me being there, but working with an amazing and phenomenal team of staff. Not only that, my other hat that I wear is I am the board president of Harmony House Women's Shelter, which is the only second stage women's shelter here in Eastern Ontario. I've been in this role now for a year and a half, and it's been exciting. And so I'm really excited to talk about this work and the gender-based violence sector from this perspective, which I feel is an interesting one to look at. But I'm also excited to talk about a little bit more about my own activism within the sector. It started very young for me. My first introduction to the GBV sector started through my best friend and her mom, who worked at a women's shelter in Toronto, where I got to go to the Dyke March with, older Black queer women and learn about what anti-violence work looked like from people who look like me at such a young and tender age, as well as look at it from the context of a queer lens, which also means so much to me as a queer Black woman. I worked as, well, it felt like work, but it was also very natural. Also within the student movement, I did a lot of anti-violence work at my campus at Carleton University for a very, 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 very long time. That was the site of a lot of my own activist development, but it was also a site where I got to learn what teaching that knowledge to other people looked like. And since then, I've been, I don't know, I call myself a little bit of a community builder, trying to foster community where I can. I've organized with the Ottawa Dyke March here. I've been involved volunteering with Planned Parenthood Ottawa. I've also been involved in a number of like nonprofit realms, but one that I'm really proud of that's taken a little break due to COVID-19 is the Venus Envy Access Fund. Venus Envy is a feminist education-based sex shop here in Ottawa. And we and a bunch of other folks kind of got together to think about funding opportunities for our community. And it's a community that I love and that has taken so much care of me and that I'm hoping to be a part of giving back. And so I'm really excited about this conversation, and I'm thankful to everyone, my co-panelists, to Yami, who I want to shout out. Yami played a very, very integral role in my learning of anti-violence work here in Ottawa. And I want to give them the accolades, because I think without seeing them lead in this city, I would have been like, oh, I just need to back up. Maybe there isn't a space for Black people leading this work. So thank you, Yami. And I want to thank all of my co-panelists for what you do. And I want to thank the opportunity to be here again. And for all the people who are here in attendance, I always feel like these are co-learning opportunities. And so I'm excited to learn from you folks as much as I think you folks are excited to learn from me.
Thank you, Debbie. You're gonna make me mess up my mascara. And last, we have someone who I've admired. I admire everyone, but have admired her work over the years. Met her first at a Learning VAW Network event, probably like 5-6 years ago. And she's the ED of Redwood, Abby.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Yami. I'm super excited to be here today, sharing space with everyone. This amazing panelists. I think about it and I'm like, how did I get this privilege to share space with these amazing people? So yeah, I truly feel privileged. It's definitely more than $1 million. I'm really grateful for everyone that is also participating in this discussion today. My name is Abby Ajibalade, and like Yami said, I am the executive director at the Redwood. It's a gender-based violence organization. We support women and non-binary folks to live and thrive without abuse, without homelessness, without poverty. We do this through collaboration, through learning, through advocacy. In my life, why am I in this as part of this panel today? GBV, gender-based violence, anti-Black racism work, dismantling structures that perpetuate all of this is at the core of who I am. I want to say that. I feel like I dare say that. I have been doing this work for close to 20 years now in Canada. I have a legal background, so the intersection of gender-based violence and the law. What do we have a legal system? Could we have a justice system? Those are some of the things that kind of drive my day-to-day. I come here today with my voice and with the voices of many women, many non-binary folks that we've served as an organization over the years, as a sector over the years, currently serving at this moment. I feel like I'm here to hold space for them as well. And I'm just looking forward and excited to today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. Okay, so as you can see, our panelists are just phenomenal, and I'm so excited to get into the discussion today around looking within our GBV sector. and calling truth to power, and also looking at the multiple ways that accountability can occur. So to start off, I wanted to ask the question, knowing that 2020 was a year where we saw a resurfacing of visibility around anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and state violence. We were also amidst a global pandemic that disproportionately impacted Black folks here in Canada. And then that there was this nuanced layer around gender-based violence and sexual violence and the heightening of it due to COVID-19. And so from your perspectives, what trends have you noticed in the last year or so around those intersections? So maybe we'll start off with Debbie.
Thanks so much. I like this question because, and I like the question in the context of the role I bring into this conversation from a board of directors perspective. One trend that I guess I've seen from our sector, but then also in other nonprofit social justice-based organizations, is the trend around the leadership conversation. That all of a sudden, organizations are either being called out, which I will give credit, keep doing that work, people, but then also taking the time to self-reflect, to look at what our leadership looks like, and do we have Black people in positions of leadership, in particular Black people who have experiences dealing with misogyny or trans misogyny. Here in Ottawa, there were a number of nonprofits, and it felt like all at the same time started announcing that they were hiring executive directors that were Black, myself included. And so it was a very interesting time to see that, because I think through that trend, and this was something I was seeing across the country, people were talking about, is this people recognizing that Black people really we're the shit and we do bring a lot in our perspective to leadership? Or is it just simply reactionary? And I myself had to think about that too, because I was also, well, this is before we saw the uprisings in the summer, but I was also thinking about what leadership looked like when my organization, or Harmony House, went into hiring our own executive director. And even if it wasn't just the race of the person, it was what leadership qualities are we looking for? What is the type of feminist leadership that I often try to talk about that we want to see? And so I think when we talk about leadership, not only are we looking at it from the front lines, I often have to think about it from the perspective of who do you not see? And this is why I think a conversation about board leadership in this context as well is super important, because often these conversations about oh, let's just hire people, et cetera, we never ask who's doing the hiring. And in this trend that I've noticed, and in contextualizing it for myself, I often want people, and I don't know how many people are here in the room, sit on boards of directors for women's shelters or anti-violence sectors, or shelter, sorry. But there's a conversation to be had about the role in which boards play in shaking up what leadership looks like by starting off there. And I'm super grateful for the opportunity to have been almost not headhunted, but approached to join Harmony House's board, because I came in at a time where there was a clean slate change in the executive. And we all came from the same perspective of these are what our values are. We recognize the significance of these values for this organization. What does it look like from our position? It meant that there were going to be changes. One of the changes in particular, and I won't go into too much detail, was at the staff level. And we realized that we had a role to play to ensure that the individuals who were leading our organization also, walked the talk in that perspective. And so our recruitment process for an ED was pretty intensive. We hired an ED at the beginning of the pandemic. So I want to give a shout out to the person. She is amazing, and she is everything that I think we've ever wanted. But I think it took having leadership, not only just me on the board, like as the board chair, but other folks as well, to like really focus on the fact that like if we slipped up, this would have a trickle effect. And it wasn't easy. It isn't easy. I don't know how many times I've had to apologize to staff members for sometimes messing up. But if there's one thing that I think is super important is that in my role and in focusing on leadership, leadership helps to kind of set what the standard is. We can influence policy and procedures. We can inform and support staff members to also do things that are based on leadership, and that's a good thing. I often think about how the leaders and how we're supporting leadership in our organization also showed during this time of uprising where, you know, our ED was like, we'd like to go to this march and hand out pamphlets about defunding the police. Can we do that? And I was just like, well, yes, you can. And I think if this was in a completely different organization where a president who had both the lived and professional experience said no, there could have been conflict. But for me, I often just think that boards play a particular role. Leadership is a conversation that we're going to continue to see. Who makes up leadership is a conversation we're going to continue to see, and it's an interesting one. And I think for the folks who are here, don't take for granted the role, not only that the board of directors play, but like how power is so nuanced and very specific depending on how it's contextualized, and that, I don't know, leadership plays a very, 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 very important role in our work, and who makes up leadership plays a role. And it's something for folks to think about. It's one I'm continuing to think about, and I'm excited to see what it looks like in the future.
Thank you, Debbie. On that like wavelength of leadership within organizations, I'm going to turn it to Abby or Jackie to speak as Black women who have been in leadership positions for over, 2 decades within the GBV sector, and some trends that you have noticed in relation to the current moment that we're in with those intersections around anti-Black racism and COVID-19, and anything else, of course, that you want to bring up.
Okay, I'll go. Thank you, Yami. First, I want to acknowledge everything that Debbie talked about. Even though I've been currently in my position for about 4.5 years now. Prior to then, we know what the GBV sector looked like as well for a long time. But I won't go too much into that. I think she did justice to what that looks like. But truthfully, I think what COVID-19 has done is really brought to light the critical need to reassess the ways in which we respond to gender-based violence. As the pandemic's outbreak unfolded alongside the global spotlight on anti-Black racism, for us at the Redwood, and if I dare speak for the gender-based violence sector, an opportunity opened up for us to pause and deeply examine the existing frameworks in which we work. The 3 pandemics of COVID-19, anti-Black racism and gender-based violence simultaneously affecting our communities provided grounds to legitimize arguments that long had been cast to the peripheries, advocating for alternative models of ensuring community safety and responses that go beyond law enforcement. I don't want to go too much into the legal, but I also I also don't want to rehash everything that was discussed yesterday by Dr. Rachel Zellers and Harry Roth, which, by the way, was incredible discussion. I just want to put that out there. I could not stop listening until the end of it. But we cannot also talk about reimagining community services with all that these 3 pandemics have brought on us, without talking about survivor-centered community safety responses beyond the law enforcement. We've seen the same rationale play out in the mental health sector. That's a conversation that is going on a lot as well in this last 6 months, calling for the reallocation of police funding to community-led services, such as Reach Out Response Network, for those who know about that network. Their team has made significant headway in their efforts to create a non-police, anti-oppressive, trauma-informed mental health emergency service model led by clinicians and peer workers from the communities they serve. As these efforts gain momentum, I anticipate there will be much potential for us as well in the GBV sector to collaborate with such emergency response teams, given the multi-directional ways these issues of mental health, substance use, gender-based violence, and anti-Black racism intersect. With these movements and the mainstream acknowledgement of anti-Black racism, I believe it is a pivotal time for the gender-based violence sector to finally seize the opportunity to make these critical connections and tap into the expertise that lies within the communities themselves. The struggle to end violence cannot be found through law enforcement, especially for communities that face systemic discrimination and experience racialized violence through policing and the prison system, which is steeped in anti-Black racism. We need to look within our communities more. We need to hear the women, non-binary folks, survivors of abuse. We need to bring those voices back and really hear from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. I would echo what we've heard from Abby, but also Debbie, and want to acknowledge that, you know, in my own work, specifically in rape crisis centers, and certainly since the pandemic, there has been room to have more of a conversation about the unique needs of multiply marginalized individuals, of Black women, to really have a greater focus on the intersectional experiences that promotes African Black women's workers' perspectives on feminist organizing, which undoubtedly, and certainly based on my research, has led to a focus on the needs of you know, multiply marginalized survivors, and how our services must respond to their needs. So that's not a new conversation. I think African Black women in centers and other racialized women in centers have advocated for these things for a long time, is what my research has shown. What's different now with the number of pandemics we have at this time, as mentioned, is that there's more of an appetite. There's an interest, it appears as a vested interest to have a better understanding of how we can work differently to meet the needs of certainly of African Black women. I've seen an increase in, and not specifically in rape crisis centers, but in the gender-based violence sector, targeted programming to meet the needs of these communities, starting a conversation, even if it's a drop-in or a group, you know, as a way to engage, you know, non-binary and other marginalized survivors who have not been well served, are underrepresented as service users in the sector. There's more work happening at this time, and I don't mean in urban settings. It's important to recognize, yes, the urban settings, gender-based violence services in those settings seem to lead the way for the rest of us in the sector on you know, having programming that's meeting the needs of survivors across all intersections. And so we're certainly seeing more of that in urban settings, but I think it needs to ripple further, you know, to those in the more remote, what would be considered remote or rural areas. And I'm glad to see that work starting. But I really want to make the point that this is not new. You know, the vision, the wisdom, the calling out and naming to move in this direction is actually not new. So it's important then that, you know, some of the conversation about nothing for us without us is really integrated in how we move forward. So I'm very curious to see what that will look like in the coming months, to know, is this something that'll eventually fade away, or is there really commitment to systemic change at this time, which I think is gravely needed in our sector, or else we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? So, and it's timely, but I would like to see the commitment beyond, that term we've heard, the flavor of the month. Is it really going to continue beyond this period of intense awareness globally, but certainly within our sector? So I'm looking forward to being a part of that conversation and really calling that out and doing that work, because there seems to be I would say like a glimmer of hope that I haven't seen for quite some time in the sector to move in that direction.
Thank you so much. And Sophia, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond as well.
Yeah, I think because of the sector in which the specific sector in which I work, where we do address gender-based violence and other issues experienced by gender minorities, but within a disability context, with COVID, and with everything that has happened in the summer, and the mass organizing within Black communities, what trends I've seen is all of a sudden everybody wants to hop on the wagon, which, if approached carefully, can, as all of you already said, can be turned into a more institutional and long-term and sustainable, can lead to sustainable changes. But within the disability context, we've just seen how neglected people living with different types of disabilities have been by society, and how every single service, including gender-based violence services, needs to be catered to survivors, but also needs to have that aspect of accessibility put forward. We were all of a sudden put into, so most women who will have experienced gender-based violence, including sexual assault, will have been the person who will perpetrate that violence will be a close, like a loved one, a close person, a partner, someone who lives inside the same house, and all of a sudden everyone was locked into their own homes. And so if our services aren't accessible, if counseling or proximity to services aren't available, then those people are truly neglected by our efforts. And so, for example, at my organization, at Dawn Canada, we had a project to create peer support programs for women with disabilities having experienced gender-based violence. And we decided to have it put online. We decided that both the training for the people giving the peer support, but also accessing the peer support, would be done online, so that more people, whether it's because they have some type of physical disability, or it's because they can't, and they depend on their partners or on the person that abuses them to leave their home or to be driven around, so that they could be able to access that help. We've also been, a trend that I've seen is that all of a sudden everybody wants to learn about accessibility, which is great. Again, if it's approached properly, hopefully we can kind of milk it so that it produces sustainable change. And I just saw in the chat that someone was talking about visible and invisible disabilities, and absolutely, we don't put any type of disability on a hierarchy. And our understanding and our definition of disability is extremely large and encompasses every single disability, and that includes mental health, that includes sporadic disabilities, that includes episodal. And so one thing that has happened is that everybody wants to learn about accessibility and the different ways that they can be accessible. And I think that even on being accessible, Black organizing, and specifically Black women, gender nonconforming people, and trans folk organizing have always led in the way of accessibility. And so a trend that I've seen is more and more of us. I've only been organizing for less than 10 years, about 8 years, but a lot of us have been going back to our elders, have been going back to the people who have done it before, the people who we have to learn from, to not repeat the same mistake, or to just not reinvent the wheel. And so what I've seen and what I've tried to do and what has truly warmed my heart is intergenerational information and knowledge sharing, which is so important, and also neglect. That was a very long-winded little rant that I went on, but I do want to say I really, really, really like the way that Debbie spoke of leadership, because I think we tend, in our organizations, we tend to mirror structures of oppression that exist within society. We tend to mirror the structures of functioning and of administration that oppress us within society. And so thinking of leadership as in empowering, as in being leaders, empowering other people to lead, as Debbie explained, I think that's absolutely amazing. I don't think that we need like a head, someone to lead the way, but we need to take into consideration people who have the experience, people who have been doing it the longest, people who are our elders, who have lived through different situations, but that could be applied to what we're living through right now, to empower ourselves to lead, but then of creating a chain reaction to keep that going and keep that momentum. That was another long-winded rant for me.
A very necessary rant, and a lot of knowledge that you dropped. So thank you for that. You know, I think that there's a theme that's emerging here around Black folks' participation and leadership in the anti-violence movement, whether it be from, as Abby pointed out, the relationship to the state and police not being, or the criminal justice or the carceral or legal system being a singular response to gender-based violence and sexual violence. And that in many ways it was Black organizers who were calling attention to that 30, 40 years ago and not mirroring that. And in many ways, how we have led the way around ensuring, as Sophia noted, a disability justice lens and calling at the intersections of so many experiences because of our own positionality, you know, knowing that mental health is something that often leads to Black death. And the framework in which, you know, Debbie offered around leadership, right? And the to some degree, calling us to rethink tokenization. We've all probably seen that image from Coco where you hire the woman of color, she starts speaking, board of directors are like, oh, and then we see this trajectory of women leaving the movement because of speaking truth to power. And, you know, Jackie, when you talk about, and Sophia, when you talk about the lineage, right, of intergenerational organizing, I remember reading an article by Lana James in 2019, and she spoke to how Black women don't, you know, access services in the same ways as white women in sexual assault centers. And thinking to myself, wow, I wonder how many stories are not told right, about the lineage of our anti-violence movement, and specifically Black and non-binary folks women and non-binary folks' participation in it. So I'm wondering if we can lean into that a bit, and starting off with you, Jackie, bringing in that lens of what you've noticed around intergenerational organizing.
Thank you, Yami and Sophia, for speaking quite poignantly about intergenerational organizing and how important that is. And I think just in my own work, having interviewed 10 African Black women in the sector who have worked or volunteered in the sector within the last 25 years, their experiences profoundly speak to that organizing work that they were a part of, but also they bring many stories of how African Black women have organized within and outside of the movement. Because speaking to, as you did, Yami, the ways in which Black women may and non-binary folk may choose to access services or not, it has a lot to do with the ways in which they prioritize their needs. And it's not always just their needs, it's their community needs, and how that's an important part of the conversation when we talk about African Black survivors. It's also about the community needs. And for these survivors, given the many forms of intersectional violence they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, their experience of sexual violence trauma, for example, may not be high on the priority list because they might be dealing with anti-Black racism at work, at school, in their community, dealing with anti-Black racism and systemic racism and intergenerational trauma all at once, in terms of dealing with systems and how they continue to be marginalized and oppressed within systems. When we talk about Canadian nation building and how some of these gender-based violence services have been sites of Canadian nation building in their lives, and that means that might not be the safest space for them to access for support. So they might seek support in the community from elders, from aunties and others who, as I heard mentioned earlier, I forgot from who, they may not identify as feminists, but they in fact engage in work for their community, for themselves, that would be regarded as feminist work as we know it today. However, it has not been captured in feminist canons. So interestingly, that work is still largely invisible, is what I heard from the participants. But many have their experiences of engaging in forms of resistance and organizing intergenerationally because it didn't fail. Whether they were able to speak to someone who was so instrumental in their life as they moved in these spaces, in gender-based violence spaces, they often attributed that to some of the older African Black women and non-binary folks who they met in the movement. So when they arrived, they were always very few and far between, but there was always someone that they can call out and say they remember that person, and how they just took them under their wings, whether they were from the same center or not, the same shelter or not, or they had those experiences in the sector. They in fact remember that they existed. They remember how they supported them and passed on stories of, ways to survive and thrive in this movement and last as long as they did. Or they encounter those that left the movement because it was very harmful to them, and it was important for their, like a self-protective factor to remove themselves and do work elsewhere where they had great impact that unfortunately was not recognized in the movement. So that intergenerational, looking at that lineage of what that looks like, I heard from sort of, younger women and non-binary folks in the movement, how there was always someone that they remember that kind of took them in and really supported them and mentored them. And sometimes that meant just showing up, right? Being in those spaces where you might be the only two African Black people in the space. That was important to them, that they showed up and they were visible. Because as mentioned earlier, we weren't going to get into too much around leadership and tokenism, and that does in fact exist. But the reality is just seeing someone else and having someone to connect to as a younger person in the movement, it went a long way in supporting them and validating that we were in fact in this movement, we contributed to the movement as well. We have a long history organizing before the formal formation of, for example, the anti-rape movement or the women's movement in Canada, which is my site specifically, and how we could recognize the roles we played in let's say, education or in community organizing, in other ways and spaces, how we showed up. And that was important to see those connections and learn from that, to support us in our practice, right? As we grow in this work.
Thank you, Jackie. I want to invite any of the other panelists to weigh in.
If I can, oh, please, Libby.
No, you go first.
Black elders have protected me on my whole path throughout my studies, throughout my learning, throughout my organizing, throughout in the work position that I am in today. I was lucky enough that when I was transitioning from the student movement, so I'm talking about this because intergenerational knowledge and sharing and learning is important within the organizing that we do, but also I think that as organizers and as teachers and as people who work within this movement, that relationship is also really important, not only for the services that we provide, but also for ourselves. And so speaking from experience, when I was transitioning from the student movement sector to a more largely Montreal-based community work, I was lucky enough that Rachel Zellers was still in Montreal at the time, and was sending me links to scientific to different journals and articles, and we had like one night every 2 weeks that we would come together for dinner and discuss whatever she had sent me with a bunch of other Black youth. And I was lucky enough that Robin Maynard was also in Montreal and was writing her book at the time, Policing Black Lives, and needed someone to type things for her as she was reciting the book. And so I was able to take on that role. She needed someone to organize her book launch in Montreal. And so so these relationships that I forged, and I also want to shout out Marliane Lopez, who is an amazing organizer here in Montreal and has worked in gender-based violence forever. And I want to thank her because when I went from freelancing to looking for a more stable job, and stable in the financial way, and I was trying to apply to all these jobs in the community sector, I was able to go to her and be like, how's this organization? Because she had been in the feminist movement for so long in Montreal as a Black queer woman, I was able to go to her and be like, how much violence will I experience within this organization? And so I've been protected and looked after. And it's also the knowledge that they've shared with me and the ways in which I should approach the work, but it's also my own existence. I don't think if I had made certain choices or decisions uninformed by their knowledge, I'm barely 26 years old. I'm 26 years old. But I've already burnt out once. And so I don't believe I would be here to keep doing the work that needed to be done. And it's something I'm just learning now of the presence of Blackness within the disability movement. Not necessarily in Canada, but throughout, not necessarily in Quebec, but throughout Canada. And so I'm just emailing every single Black disability activist and organizer that I can to hopefully provide my own resources to them, but also learn from them. I think, like I said, there's no use in reinventing the wheel. There's no use in or rather, there is so much use in being informed by people who have done the work before us. Yeah, I'm a big proponent of intergenerational partnership and learning and sharing, and I just Black folk have made sure that I'm here on this panel today, and I'm still organizing within my communities, and I'm forever thankful for that.
I wanted to first just say how grateful I am for both Jackie and Sophia to share both their perspectives and the stories that have kind of informed their perspectives on intergenerational organizing within like Black feminist spaces. And it's actually making me very emotional, kind of thinking back of like at the aunties and the elders who, and they don't, and some of them don't even know it, that just simply their presence is the reason why I'm here today. They have no idea. They probably don't even know my name, but just the fact that I saw them and I can continue to just like, thank you, social media, like take a look to see what they're doing is what keeps me going. And I mentioned this about, you know, my best friend's mom who worked at the Toronto Rape Crisis Center in Toronto, we were like in middle school and bringing us to dyke brunches where I got to see Black lesbian anti-violence activists, and I could say that's what I want to do. Like it's really making me emotional because that was my awakening where I said I'm going to do this when I get older. And for my mom, who, you know, I think for a lot of Africans, you know, there's only 3 career pathways: doctor, lawyer, engineer. And for her, for me to even like walk my mom through it, and for her to be like, you'll do that, because she's like, I trust what you're going to do. It's just beautiful. And I think of the aunties who might check in on me like maybe once a year, but it's like those cheerleaders who are the reasons why like I am still here. And there is like, as a young person, I will always give credit to the teachers of our movements who've been here before. And I think in self-reflecting, now that we're in this weird transitionary period where like the auntie title is becoming one that I'm adopting, what I want to be for younger generations and what I have been doing and what I'm hoping to set up to hopefully teach them is what I'm thinking about too, and to keep it going, because if there's something that our ancestors have taught us, it's to do that. It's to continue passing that along. And I hope to keep that spirit alive. And I just wanted to like, just say what you both have said, give me chills and made me emotional. And it's definitely, it's something, unless you know, I think if you have experienced, you really know, it's really hard to articulate to people who don't get it. But I think for us, it is something that is so beautiful. And I love that it's our thing, that we like, yeah, the aunties, like, it's us, we know what we're talking about. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I can't wait to be that role for somebody one day.
Thank you, Debbie. Aunties play an important role. Their gossip is how we keep communities safe, you know? So even though they may tell you about themselves, aunties are important and have been important to the movement. And wanted to offer Abby, if there's anything you wanted to add to the conversation around intergenerational.
You know what, Yami, I just want to say ditto to everything that folks have shared. For myself as well, I feel like I have rested, flown, and times when you're tired. I've rested on the shoulders of great Black women and non-binary, older non-binary folks who have been there in many ways for me and in this work as a young Black woman when I just came to Canada as a new immigrant. It was quite different, and I needed that support, and I'm so grateful that today I can say that I had this wonderful, wonderful shoulders to fly as well as to rest when I needed to, because it can be a bit tiring when you do the work. But I also know that, and one of the things that Dr. Jacqueline mentioned that I also want to, kind of touch on is the fact that these women and non-binary folks within the Black community have been doing amazing work and doing feminist work, even if it were not referred to as such. And over the years, we know that the voices of Black women, non-binary folks have been silenced within our communities, worried that the experiences of violence would confirm stereotypes used to justify surveillance and police force, such optics on the political cost of opening up dialogue of gender-based violence in Black communities at a heightened level of concern, given even with the recent spotlight on anti-Black racism. But I just feel like a lot of work has been done, a lot of work still needs to be done, but we're really grateful for the voices of those aunties and those mothers, elders who have really paved the way and done amazing work, even when they don't give it all the titles that we all call it today. Yeah.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you so much, all of you. Just, I'm sure I can see in the chat, folks are really, really appreciating the perspectives that you're bringing to the conversation. And I think, Abby, just to come back to you for a moment, you've touched upon a principle of nothing for us without us. And I'm wondering if we can lean into, I slicked my edges back, to talk a bit about how we can hold community accountable, how we can hold this GBV sector accountable for its historical perpetuation of anti-Black racism. So, yeah.
Thank you. So true. So true. Accountability is it needs to be at the core of everything that we do. We need to hold ourselves, even, self-accountability, even before it gets out into the community. History shows us the damage done by taking the simplistic understanding of feminism with the first, second, and third waves. Without an intersectional and anti-racist feminist analysis, reproduces power inequalities, keeping our most marginalized women and non-binary folks trapped in a cycle of violence and poverty and more vulnerable to criminalization. And honestly, I think gender-based violence social movements growth over the past decade has in part played a role in the perpetration of systemic oppression. I can't speak well today, pardon me, please. The sector's ongoing pursuit of professionalism has lent to the strong affiliation and dependence on law enforcement responses to legitimize the movement and secure government funding. This is despite the fact that few survivors want police involvement. Many women, non-binary folks that I've worked with have come up to say, aren't there other ways? Is this the only way I should go? Is this the only way? It almost seems as if we compel a certain way, that this is the only way. It's this way, or you know what? Nothing is going to happen. This is despite the fact that few survivors, like I said, want police involvement, especially those from our Black communities, where understandably there lies deep-seated fear and distrust. Much of the pushback to innovative and alternative approaches to gender-based violence is the misnomer that it has to be either or. It suggests there is a binary choice between the criminal justice system and alternative community-based justice models. And I want to call it options, even more rather than alternatives, because I feel like they can co-occur. This assumption puts up roadblocks in advancing innovative approaches. When I reimagine alternative transformative approaches or reimagine options, transformative options to gender-based violence, it is not to say that I believe this should replace the current criminal justice system, because I've been poked many times on that. Like, are you saying we've done so much work to get us where we are at? Isn't this taking us 2 steps backwards? And like, they can co-occur. I'm not. If any of my clients, a survivor comes up and says, I want to, go full force and use the hands of the law, I'm there. I'm there with them in terms of whatever they want to do. But if they also say that this isn't an approach I want to take, I want to see other options. We talked about the aunties, we talked about the community, the mothers, the elders. How can we use the resources that we have within the community? Those are some of the things that I'm hoping that we listen to survivors, because they are saying to us, it doesn't always have to be this one way. Let's think about different other options. I also want to say that like I mentioned, it is not to replace the criminal justice system, but rather shift away from solely relying on them. Unquestionably, these formal systems have to be in place, but at the same time, they cannot be seen as the only response. One of the most significant shortfalls we see at the moment is the gender-based violence sector's inability to take an integrative thinking approach. We need to make sure that there are multiple systems in place so survivors have options. It cannot be a one-size-fits-all approach. Those of us in the sector all think that we know what is best for survivors, but we need to listen so that they can make the choices that best fit their needs. And I know it's not coming from a bad place. We're all constantly thinking about what safety would look like. If the hands of the law is not involved, will this family be safe? Will this woman, will this person be safe? Be safe? But yeah, I think that what all of this is telling us is that we need to get together again and think about way forward, and more particularly thinking of a survivor-focused approach where the voices of survivors is really integral to whatever other options we're thinking of.
I want to invite other panelists to join in around, speak to Abby or any other points specifically around the historical perpetuation of anti-Black racism and accountability for that within our movement or our sector.
Yeah, thank you, Abby, so much for your perspective on that. I think absolutely there's much work to do in this sector. And it's important, I think, that we also look at the intersection between the sector and state, because I can't see the sector over here working in this silo, trying to make significant differences in terms of access and opportunities for African Black women and non-binary folks as workers or as survivors having access to appropriate supports without really looking at Canada's colonial imprint and how it's inscribed on the bodies of African Black women, but then how it gets reinscribed through neoliberal politics and structural and systemic violence that really affects African Black women and has led to the ongoing oppression of African Black women and non-binary folks. So I think that is important for our sector to have that understanding, to really recognize that these realities are exacerbated when we have, when basically hegemonic feminism is complicit. So for me, I think it's important that we recognize that complicity takes shape. For example, in the feminist movement's ability to really recognize and resist state violence alongside its inability to adequately acknowledge the interlocking forms of oppression that impact African Black women and their families, not just African Black women, right? So I can't speak enough to understanding how working with African Black survivors might be different from, the sector's long experience in working with other types of survivors, namely white survivors, and recognizing how when you're working with what I would say is our community, it's different. And you need to have that awareness, but you also have to look at the broader implications systemically, the connection to the state and the centers or shelters or various agencies within our sector, because it's not separate. So I'm not one to suggest we can do all these things and we'll get it right for African Black women and non-binary folks.
If I can quickly, hopefully quickly, I do go on tangents, add. So most of us, a majority of us, and the organizations in which we work receive funding from the government. That funding is project-based. Already there's a problem. So instead of tackling systemic issues at their root, we're kind of incentivized to create projects that will create quantifiable accomplishments. Now, again, we all have good intentions. We all are working towards technically the same goal. But for us to exist and to do this work, we need the funding, and that funding is limited. A lot of the funding that we receive, again, is from the government. And this is the part of some of the propaganda I was mentioning in my introduction, is that Canada was built on the genocide of Indigenous people. It was built by the transatlantic slave trade. It was built by the dehumanization and violence towards Black folk, Indigenous folk, and also their erasure. And so, and that violence that has been lived, and that's the thing, is that violence is still lived by Black and Indigenous communities to this day. 2 months ago in NDG, a Black man named Sheffield Matthews was killed while experiencing a mental health crisis by the police. And so this is not something of the past. This is not something that we can like get over, because it's still happening. And so for me, dehumanization and the violence of Indigenous and Black folk, and especially Black and Indigenous women, trans folk, non-binary people, and Two-Spirit, is both Canada's origin story and current and main agenda. So we're being funded by an organization, a violent organization that wants to keep the status quo. And I want everyone to think about that. Because it doesn't mean that we should all give up. It just means that we need to be crafty. Like, and we are very, very crafty people. We have managed to do, and I'm sure everyone within, like, in their path to what they're doing now, have worked under like a limited budget, or even no budget at all. I've done it. Sucks, but I've done it. And I'm sure every person has that kind of story where they had to create something out of nothing. And so we're crafty people. And so we need to get around all the limitations and all the restrictions that are bound to the funding we receive from this historically violent, genocidal, white supremacist entity, and free us. Easy, right? Like, no problem there. Obviously not. But so why I want to say this is that I want, again, and it's a criticism of me too. My organization, all of my organization's funding comes from federal and provincial government. Like, it's not, I'm not like taking the, like, I'm not pretending I'm on some like high moral ground or anything. I just want to like put that out there that, again, it's origin story and main current agenda. The status quo is talked about as some stable and tranquil path. It's not. The status quo for Black folk is violence. It's violence and trauma. And so we need to actively fight that and fight to exist. So we're battling on multiple fronts. And I really thought this was gonna like sound more like motivating than it actually does, but it's a reality. And if Black folk are anything, is resilient, because we're all here and we all have those stories of how we've managed to do something impossible. But I think moving away from quantifiable projects, it might be the first step, and thinking more long term, but doing that while still receiving project-based funding. Also, something I want to add to what Abby said, which I thought was absolutely amazing about defunding the police and just having multiple sources of paths to take for survivors, is that involving the police and the justice system in a gender-based violence survivors like road to hopefully something better is prioritizing punitive steps towards the perpetrator rather than prioritizing the health and well-being of the survivor. If the survivor wants those punitive steps to be undertaken, that's absolutely fine. But I think that our work should definitely be more focused on, as Abby said, the survivor's needs, but also just like, yes, not relying so much on, oh, once the perpetrator is punished, which we've all seen the statistics, they're often not. Once the perpetrator is punished, the survivor is going to be able to live life normally and healthily again, without considering the long-term trauma that gender-based violence has on them. And so I think that's something also to think about. I have no solutions. I'm just sharing information.
I think that's what it comes to, right? Is when we're able to talk about it in community, that is how we build solutions, right? And a resource that I wanted to share, Sophia, because I think that it is really important, specifically around the funding conversation, um, and how projects and state dictates organizing, is the work, again, of women of color, Insight Women of Color, the nonprofit industrial complex. The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, the book. Feels like yes, is a great starting point, and was for me in terms of imagining different possibilities that could exist around this front, specifically around gender-based violence organizing. And I wanna lean into, before we get to the Q&A portion of today's panel. But Debbie, I'm curious about, I love dreaming. For folks who have tuned into the Nat Ministry, she talks about Black people resting. And she talks about it in the context of us being able to dream different possibilities, and rest as revolution. And it really makes me think about what possibilities can exist, knowing that we are structurally working within an inherently anti-Black, white supremacist, colonialist, gender essentialist sector. How can we re-envision possibility within our sector, from a trans-inclusive, disability justice, abolitionist, potentially, framework? So pass it over to you to give us some
Yes.
dreams around possibility.
I love this question. I love it so much, because I think dreaming and reimagining the future is like one of the most accessible tools to us. It is like, you can dream, everyone can dream. But I think for people who, and I'm looking at Black folks, in particular Black women, Black non-binary folks, anyone who has to deal with the realities of like misogyny and gender-based violence, like dreaming is what we got. And I think one thing that is just so beautiful about it, especially for like, we just had a conversation about looking at like the historical implications of anti-Black racism within the movement. And I think what dreaming allows us to do, it allows us to like reimagine the past to kind of plan for the future. And for me, and I've had these conversations, especially from the perspective of young people, because I'm like, if you want to have beautiful conversations about reimagining the future, get a bunch of young people and youth. And I mean, even like really young, even like kids, like asking them a question and making them draw it. There are some beautiful lessons that can be learned there. And I think we can't imagine our future. And I mean, I can't imagine a future without a violence, without acknowledging how the role of like white supremacy plays and how it impacts our movements and how it impacts our knowledge, et cetera. And so I think, I don't have an answer. It's one of those things similar to Sophia. It's like, what's the solution? But I think I have advice. And I think my advice is we can imagine and enact our radical future like right now. We don't have to wait 10 years from now. We don't have to think about it and then build a strat plan. And I say that from a nonprofit sector. Like the imagining and that future that we want doesn't have to wait. And I think that's a beautiful lesson for all of us here, especially if we're talking about, you know, the limitations of funding that's project-based. We can literally bring the future we want into our programming today, in our research, in our advocacy, in starting now to form what that future we want, not only for us, but for future generations. And I think going back to the conversation about intergenerational organizing and aunties, a lot of us come from communities where we set up things for the future. We're thinking about our families, and we don't wait until we get $1,000. Like my mom has been like I joke about the house that she's been building in Ghana for so long. That has been part of her reimagining the future since she moved to Canada in the mid-'80s. And in that process is thinking about me. It's thinking about my children. And I just think it's such an easy, beautiful, and creative tool. And I think Sophia mentioned it about us having to be innovative. have a brainstorming session where you just dream and dream together. And I think we can do that in our movement in so many different ways. I think one of the most beautiful things about feminist activism for me is bringing community together and just talking about random stuff and like what is the vision that we have for the future. And sometimes you can map it out with strategy and funding, and sometimes it's just thinking about it, because for so many of us, even just imagining a world where it's free of violence and we don't have to deal with anti-Blackness or racism is sometimes far-fetched, and just doing so is a radical act in itself. And so if there's any advice I have for anyone, that future that you want, that radical feminist future, the one that I want, I'm doing my best to start it now and to enact it now. And I think all of us can do it in our sector and the different roles that we all play. We could do it yesterday. So that's my thoughts on that.
And Debbie, I want to just call you back in again, because I think in dreaming about possibilities, one of the ways that you shared with me personally that you've been able to do that is knowing that trans Black women are disproportionately affected by sexual and gender-based violence, that you've pushed within your own role to ensure that shelters are accountable to trans women. So yeah, just wanted to offer that.
Yes. I know I joked about like strategic planning sessions and dreaming sessions, but that bit of an overlap there, especially for our organization. And I'll talk about Harmony House a little bit. And it started even before I joined the organization, and trying to reimagine what women's shelters, but also the gender-based violence sector looks like for the most marginalized people in our communities. And in it was coming in and squashing this idea or ridding this and the elephant in the room sometimes in the sector about the history of trans violence, that when intersected with anti-Black violence, we are leaving out some of the most important people in our community. And so some of the things that I've been grateful to be able to help inspire, but then foster with my team is like looking at our mission and looking at our mandate and thinking, is it really reflecting where we are at now as an organization? And we went through a strategic planning process late last year in 2020, and through it came a new mandate and a new mission that talks about gender we're trying to rid ourselves of the binary way, but we're acknowledging that like gender-based violence isn't just something that cisgender women have to deal with, and that's being captured in just who we are. And that will then trickle down in our policies and procedures to show that like our organization now looks like this. We are committed to this. Part of that reimagining too is also having the very real conversations about what harm may have been caused in the past because we weren't there yet, and making sure that we're committed to that change, and that we're like showing it to the community that we serve, we're engaging them too. Because I think part of this conversation is trust. We've talked about this in so many different ways. When people are like, I speak to an auntie to see if this is the organization I should go to, you know, how do I feel about like accessing this service? Part of the historical components of anti-Black racism in this is that trust has been broken. And trust continues to be broken in our inability to act and in our lack of accountability. And I think when I say that like dreaming and imagining our future is accessible is such an easy tool for us to like imagine what things could look like, to set ourselves up for success, to build that and build that future. And so that's what our organization has done. And it's only the beginning for us. We're trying to learn lessons from other organizations and women's shelters who have been doing the same thing. But I think there's ways in which we can learn from each other. And honestly, enacting that future we wanted immediately has worked for us. And we're hoping that it just means future successes as a whole.
Thank you, Debbie. So a couple minutes before we start opening up the Q&A, but I wanted Jackie, Abby, and Sophia, please jump in around possibility and dreaming.
Thank you so much. I was excited to hear this conversation as it's unfolding right now, and thank you, Debbie and Yami, in your take on dreaming, because I believe, and I keep going back to my research, because something very important that I think the participants spoke to in relation to possibilities for the future is the importance of looking back, and how, in fact, um, we're not working from a blank slate. We have many teachings in terms of drawing on Indigenous knowledge, cultural practices that have been passed on generationally, and looking at that, those important ancestral teachings that we carry with us across the diaspora. So it doesn't matter, where you may have been born, or where you are today. We carry those teachings in our DNA, right? That knowledge is in our DNA. And that's why I say we're not starting with a blank slate as to how we're going to do this work in our sector. And I heard really, things that were familiar to me that I heard about, for example, was Vex money, right? Vex money was a cultural practice among Caribbean women of, they were preparing to go on a date, and before they left, they would always ensure that they had their Vex money with them. So that was a teaching in terms of anything that could go wrong. You had your own funds to draw on to ensure that you can get back home safely and quickly if needed. But also I heard about Susu. So Susu's from the Twi language, and it's related to planning. And it's a cultural practice among people of African ancestry as it relates to saving money, and how by paying into these small increments of money, it can lead to an outcome for you where you have a system to help you save money in increments. And what was important about this is this, was recognized as embodied knowledge that was being passed on. It was embodied, passed on from some of the participants' aunties and mothers as a cultural practice to support them in ensuring that they learned African values, African-centered values, and values such as self-sacrifice, reciprocity, collectivity, to really ensure that it could lead to teachings related to financial literacy, teachings related to economic empowerment for African Black women and non-binary folks in our communities. So those Indigenous knowledges really helped to ensure it was setting us up for the future. And that's why I say, as we think about our sector and how we plan for what we're dreaming possibilities, to ensure that there's balance, I think it's important that we also look back for those teachings that can inform what our way forward looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie.
No, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jacqueline. As you were talking, just even taking me back to Susu, it's just a great feeling to have just hearing that again. I want to quickly touch on what Sophia said, even around two things I want to bring out very quickly. The first one is when you talked about being really, crafty when we collect these monies that are project-based, and how do we move forward? And I just wanted to quickly chip in at that time to say, yeah, what that helps us to do is solutions which we're grateful for, but what we really need is change. Beyond those solutions that we deal with in one project, from one project to the other. And I think you put it so beautifully. I'm not even going to go there other than to just add that on to say, yeah, solutions, change. What do we really want to see? You also talked about perpetrators in jail, and everything just seemed okay when that happens. And I think I want to talk about the premise of dreaming from that angle. And I'm sorry if I overflog this issue of the justice legal system. It's just something that really keeps me up in the night when I think about how many people, we cannot even call them survivors today, that we've lost to femicide, and how this keeps me up in the night. And as I know, would be doing the same for my colleagues. This past decades, few decades, all of this have really demonstrated that the gender-based violence sector's heavy reliance on policing and prosecution and imprisonment has been mostly ineffective in addressing the issue. Gender-based violence shows no signs of slowing down. 1 minute I hear every 6 days we lose someone to domestic homicide or gender-based violence, to femicide, or sometimes I hear every 2.5 days. It shows no signs of slowing down, and it is telling that this approach serves no real deterrent for perpetrators, people causing harm, and the stopgap response fails to get to the root of the issue. Again, don't want to overflog this issue, but in order for us to dream, we really need to look at what we're doing now. We need to kind of, if I can put it this way, kind of merge reality with our dreams. I want to be able to, close my eyes and see a world where gender-based violence does not exist anymore. I'm hoping for one day when I don't have to do this work, not because I'm retiring, but that there isn't a need for shelters or programs such as mine anymore. I'm looking forward to that time. That's part of my dream. I just feel like beyond the revolving door prison is for perpetrators. Punitive measures also mean survivors from the most marginalized populations are more likely to be arrested, to be prosecuted, deported, have their children apprehended. Again, we need to come back. I keep saying that I don't have answers to it as well, just like many of my colleagues have shared. And I'm not saying that moving away from this is just going to answer all of our problems and everything would just be perfect and we'll live a wonderful life. No, but I think if we don't start from somewhere, we would never be able to get to a point where maybe some of these dreams we're having can actually become reality. I'm just going to leave it there.
Ashe. Sophia.
Nothing much to add. I think all three of you's description or approach to dreaming is amazing. I think it's something, dreaming is something I need to start doing a bit more. And I think it's really interesting actually, because each one of you approached it in a very different way of taking into consideration the past, dreaming without any limits, and dreaming specifically in relation to the work that we're doing. So I guess my dream is that we're all out of the gender-based violence business, because unfortunately, because of the type of funding that we received, it is a business and it is a career, it has become a career, and I hope we're all out of it because it just doesn't exist anymore. Mirroring what Abby said. But yeah, I am gonna start dreaming now a bit more. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. So we are at the time where we're gonna lean into questions by the audience. Thank you, each and every one of you, for the perspectives that you have brought today. I think I'm remiss, and we'll give you a proper closing in terms of some of the themes that have been drawn, but truth to power was spoken, and truth to accountability was spoken as well. And so in leaning into some of the questions, I'm going to take a moment here. And lots of great questions that came through. And so we're going to start off with the trajectory of leadership. So somebody asked, I'm wondering how boards and organizational structures can look more transformative and aligned with grassroots Black feminist practices. So
I love that question.
Mm-hmm.
I love that. Ooh. It's like I have an answer, but I'm like, where do I begin? Where do I begin? So I think sometimes we always have that like chicken and the egg conversation of like, do we need to recruit for diversity first and then do the rest of the work? Or do you try to attempt the work even though you might not do a good job because those people aren't there to begin with, and then everything will come to fruition? But I think there is something to be said, regardless of who's already in that space, for it to be intentional, to literally center Black feminisms. I didn't get to talk about it, but there was, I wanted to kind of talk about, like, I think the duty that the sector has in giving activist training to like young people. I got my earliest activist training in universities, and it's like that baton I'm trying to pass over to younger folks who are coming in, and that we shouldn't have to wait for people to go to university for them to learn about like residential schools, about anti-Blackness, colonization, the scramble for Africa, etc. And that even within our sector, we can like do that work to showcase Black feminisms to anyone who's interacting with our work, whether it be in our programming, our advocacy and awareness campaigns, our whatever type of service delivery provide, etc. I think this first starting point, and whether you have Black folks in your organization or not, is centering Black feminisms, showcasing it, showing that this is a thing that's important, because I think it provides a window for a young person to want to even volunteer with you who might be a Black feminist who is like, oh, like that's what it looks like. Perfect. And have an entryway where hopefully through mentorship, they can either become an executive director one day, or a frontline worker, or a board member, etc. Showcasing Black feminisms even in your leadership approach. There are so many lessons that organizations can like learn and replicate. I often think about it from the perspective of care, where if we look at traditional models of leadership that are very problematic in my opinion, they prioritize like sturdiness, objectivity that's like not using emotions, for example, and there are feminist leadership that you can learn to even just embody the type of like culture you have in your organization. That you can do as a starting point. But yeah, I think that's where I'll leave it there. You can use it as a starting point, but I think that there's so much more, and I feel like I wish I had time to like self-reflect and like write notes. But yeah, I think that's my starting point. You can showcase Black feminisms at any point in your organization as an entryway, and then from there, I think so much beautiful things can follow.
Thank you, Debbie. Just want to check in and see if anyone else wants to add.
Sure. I'm actually pleased to respond to this question. I would echo what you've heard from Debbie, but I would also want to lean into the acknowledging that African Black women's leadership has been in existence for a very long time in the movements, varies across many movements. Acknowledge they exist, validate and historicize their existence, acknowledge their contributions, and their contributions not just in the sector, their contributions in higher learning, their scholarship, really come to know that they exist in Canada, and there's a long history. if you need somewhere to start with Afua Cooper's work, right? If you really want to look back and look Black, start with Afua Cooper's work, right? Dr. Afua Cooper's work. I think that is so important. And that is across the entire sector, but I also want to address the importance of higher learning, because, you know, like me, my awakening, I knew things were, you know, off for a very long time. I didn't understand a lot of the different experiences I saw of African Black women in my family and my own upbringing and socialization. But it's in post-secondary education where I was able to have a vocabulary to understand feminism. What was still missing though was me and other like, right, the experience of Black women in my family. So the point is, as a starting place then, because so many of us, that awakening kind of starts there, because we can get involved in activism on campuses and in our communities. So it's important then that we recognize that we need critical decolonizing pedagogies to really importantly inform formal education settings, but also our sector, right? All of the training programs in all of the sectors, for volunteers, for staff, how that is important, because the last place we get that sort of formal learning might be in higher education, but where does it trickle down now into these spaces when we're working in the sector? It's really important that that be a part of your board development training, that be a part again of your staff training, your volunteer training, and have that really centered where we're coming to understand African Black women and non-binary folks' experiences. That would be an important place to start, in my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. You said look back and look Black. That was amazing. So I'm gonna lean into another question, and this is leaning into white supremacy and gender-based violence organizations. So the person writes, I find that gender-based violence organizations can sometimes avoid being political and talking about racial justice or defunding the police due to fears of upsetting and or dividing major donors and community partners. How can staff push their organizations to be more political? I notice for this sector, there is a view that since the work is to end gender-based violence, is for progressive organizations. Sorry, let me rephrase this. I notice for this sector, there is the view that since the work is to end gender-based violence, is progressive, organizations sometimes will not push accountability. And so what more can be done? So maybe we'll start off with Abby and Sophia.
Sure, thank you. You know, I can't completely say that the person who asked this question is wrong in terms of the fears. There are fears for sure. You constantly weigh what the impact of what you say and what you do, a stand you take within the organization, what would be the impact? What would there be a backlash? You're constantly thinking about that. I don't know if anyone would be, you know, unmindful of that, particularly as a leader of an organization and a person of color. These you have to constantly. I'm constantly weighing these options as well. And I can say this, if I can quickly use this as an example. When the issue across the border happened and George Floyd was brutally murdered by the police, and of course, around the same time, things were happening here at home in Canada. One of the things that I got from staff of my organization was defund the police and let's get out there. Let's go out there and make that, not noise, I wouldn't call it noise, but let's be out there. Why are we not on the streets? Why are we not putting out a call for that and signing on to all of these things? And it was one of the things that I took a step back and I said to them, I hear you, we are in this all together. However, we need to not act on emotions alone. We need to really sit back and look at what is really, if we do that, of course, we'll get, taking us back to what I said earlier, we will get solutions, but is that what we want alone? Or do we want to have actual change happen, address the roots of systemic racism and violence and gender-based violence? I'm sure that's what we all want to see, lasting change happen. And but since then, one of the things that conversation led to is me going back to my board and saying, this is what I'm thinking of us doing as an organization. We need to have a call to action. We need to go beyond talking about acting, again, using that term, acting on emotions and running off, signing on letters. We can do all of that. I have no problem doing that and signing these things that we 100 organizations of us will sign on to. And I know that they have helped as well, not to say that they don't help, but I'm also thinking of what else can we do and how can we hold ourselves accountable, hold government accountable, hold people in power accountable to really getting the change that we want to see happen. And I'm grateful that since we started the conversation, we've had a position paper posted. We've been taking steps beyond talking about it to actually putting action behind it. I'm all for what is the action that we want to do here. It's not enough that we talk, it's not enough that we sit together. A friend of mine always says that, let's move beyond talking to action. What does action look like? And that can only come from really looking critically at what the issues are, what the challenges are. If it be with the police, what is there? What is wrong with the police, and what do we really want to ask for? Not just the funding, but what exactly do we want to see happen? So I know I might be waffling a little bit around this question now, but as leaders in organizations, we all have a responsibility to hold ourselves accountable, to hold our organizations accountable, and to hold powers that be and the system accountable to what that change we want to see happen, to see that change happen in various ways, not just within the walls of our organizations, not just within the policies within our organizations, from within to outside, to without. Those are changes that I think are very critical for us to see transformative change happen.
Thank you, Abby. Sophia, you get the last word.
Yeah, I think that organizations, if they don't know already, which is doubtful, need to understand that most, if not all, struggles are connected. Gender-based violence lives within, that's why we talk about intersection, and lives within anti-Blackness. And so it's inevitable to have to address anti-Blackness as an issue. Even if it's just a gender-based violence organization, you will have to discuss anti-Blackness. You will have to discuss anti-indigeneity, you're going to have to discuss anti-capitalism, you have to, like, all of these things, you're going to have to talk to blend them into the work that is being done. And so, like Abby said, going to the board, if the board needs training, if the board needs an explanation, if the board needs that person to and that teacher to talk to be like, this is how these things are connected. If after that fact the board still refuses and are still, and I understand being scared of losing funding. I was fired for advocating for Black queer folk at Pride Montreal. I lost all financial stability I ever had, like 4 years ago, because I was hired to be the Black person at Pride, and then was, and then when I did my job, I was too Black, which is absolutely hilarious considering they probably chose me because I'm as light skinned as they come. I'm as non-Black passing as they come. And so I understand that fear. There are ways that I've like worked with an I used to work for my student union and they weren't clear on BLM for some reason. And so I just, we would just give money to different organizations, and those organizations would fund whatever certain movements needed or campaigns or ways to like work around the budget. But at the end of the day, if your organization doesn't recognize the importance of dismantling anti-Black racism and doesn't want to understand it, then it's a white supremacist organization. And there are probably two choices: is to stay and fight within it, which is extremely violent and harmful, but could actually lead to change. Or there is leaving it and finding a space in which you won't have to argue for the importance of your existence and of like your well-being, which is really cool. That I like not having to argue on like my humanity. And I guess also like calling out organizations that it's not only that they don't service Black folk, or they don't service Black trans folk, or they don't service Black disabled folk, and they're just actively being anti-Black. I think you can burn those organizations to the ground, in my opinion. They don't need to exist. Yeah, that's some more of the propaganda I was talking about.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you. So we are at our time. I would like to thank each one of the presenters today for bringing such a critical and nuanced lens to what it means to look within the gender-based violence sector and be accountable to the ways in which anti-Black racism is experienced systemically, structurally, and on an interpersonal level. And as we come to a closing, I want to thank all of the participants as well. There's a link to evaluation and a certificate for participation in the chat box. But I also want to say this to folks who participated. Often Black folks will share their experience, their blood, sweat, and tears. They will be called on as experts. And if anything from this panel, for non-Black folks on this call, I want you to be accountable and think about what accountability can look like outside of you just learning and listening, right? How can you bring this back to your organizations? And how can you start with yourself, right? Well, how do you perpetuate anti-Black racism? How does it inform your decisions, right? As folks in the GBV sector. So Black pain and Black spectacle has been real in 2020. Let's not continue that pattern, right? And I want to also name that the Learning VAW Network tomorrow is going to have an amazing panel called Ashe, Arts, Spirituality, Healing, and Embodiment, and it's being hosted by Raven Wings and Keisha Williams. So you can register for the session through the link provided in the chat box. Again, support for folks, the number is there in the chat box. And thank you again, everyone, and see you tomorrow. Be well, drink water, take deep breaths, and take good care of yourself. Thank you again.